Welcome. I'm Lucy Friedman, the General Coordinator of the United States of America Transactional Analysis Association, and I am delighted to be introducing one of our most esteemed, most contributing, most brilliant members, who is a world-known transactional analyst and also a force for social change, somebody who has lived through enough experiences to really understand life script and a lot of the other things that are going on in our world today. So today, Fanita English will be presenting an institute on scripts, an area that she has focused on for many years and always has innovative thoughts as well as classical knowledge to impart. So with that, I am very excited to be opening this institute with Fanita English.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you for all your support. And that's great. Good. And now, just for the sake of starting, I always like to start with what's supposed to be the group contract, and then separately from that, we make our individual contract. And then it says, by the end of this workshop, participants will be able to. So this is what you can all be tested on, assuming you will have learned it. Number one, define survival conclusions. Decisions, redecisions, scripts. Hot potatoes and episcripts, that's what you can define. Number two, describe developmental processes and script formation. Number three, know how to use the four-story exercise with necessary cautions. Number four, identify episcripts in social contexts. Okay, so this is what you'll all be experts in by 6 o'clock today. Okay, does everybody know the definition of an ego state? When I have my trainees, I say that if you can't define an ego state the way Byrne defined it and the way I adjusted it a little bit, then you're automatically flunked. So, but if you can define it, then you've automatically passed, because that's the most important thing. No, I'm going to do it for the sake of time, because we've only got a day. And that's Byrne. An ego state is a coherent, you're right, system. System is the important word. System of thoughts and feelings, or feelings and thoughts, you can put it. And Byrne says that is manifested by behavior. I change it to that can be manifested by behavior, because good actors can hide it. But when Byrne says behavior, he means anything, facial expression, or anything that you can see an ego state, he claims. The truth is, you have to be an expert to always be able to see what ego state a person is in, but you can sometimes figure it out from the words and from hearing and so on and so forth. And the reason I find it so important to define it, to insist on this word system, like a watch has a system, because it's interrelated parts that are interdependent of each other. And the reason it's so important is nowadays all the more so for PR reasons, in order to distinguish TA from all other forms of, therapy, that some forms of therapy focus on feelings and some focus on thoughts and some focus on whatever, on behavior or whatever. TA focuses on all of them, but in three systems. We have three ego states and not just one. And this, I think, is the kernel for TA, that we have three ego states. That means that we not only dialogue with other people, for me, but we dialogue with ourselves. That my parent can be speaking to my child, or my child speaking to my parent, and sometimes it's our inner language, and it's not in words, because parent and child, when it's a baby and when it's a 1-year-old, they also speak to each other, but it's not necessarily speak in language, communicate with each other. And the reason I stress that, since we talk about me and biography, this was the reason why I got into TA. Just learning that, because I was working as a psychoanalyst, and I thought that, and I was very dissatisfied with my work, and dissatisfied with what was happening, and beyond everything else which can be said, What I didn't know and didn't realize is that I was in constant dialogue with myself while I was listening to the patient, and that I was having such a hard time, my child was having such a hard time with my pen, that I was unable to listen to the client because I was so busy with myself. And to me, that is the important thing, contribution, and also to learn to hear. That doesn't mean listen, the distinction between hear and listen. To hear my parent, and it's taken me years to learn to hear the various parents in me. I also have a psychoanalytic parent. I mean, you take on parents, all kinds of things, to hear these parents and decide at each moment with my adult whether I want to listen to my parent, in other words, obey. There's a story of a little girl whom I love the story. She's out in the woods and the mother's calling her, come in, and father and mother exasperated said, Susie, do you hear me? And the child says, yes, I hear you, but I'm not listening. And that's how I respond sometimes to my parent, but this applies, okay. Now, this then means that I have, when I think of the child ego state, I have this addition in the spirit of Byrne, which is that when you look at a chronological child, there's a big difference between, let's say, a 6-month-old child and a 4-year-old child, and a 1-year-old child and a 3-year-old child even. And the more you know about children, there's a big difference even between a 2- and 3-year-old child. But at any rate, when we say child, that's not enough. So that, and I have a little drawing somewhere which shows the child ego state. I have it very well organized, as a result of which I won't find anything. So I don't have to draw it on the board. This is my image of the child ego state. Each ring, it's like a tree ring. I don't have to do it on the board, do I? You can all see it here. Each tree ring represents an age, more or less. Structurally, the child ego state, developmentally, there are different children, and therefore in my head, when I'm working with someone, it's not enough for me to think of someone as the child ego state. There are all these children ego states representing each circle, taking the analogy of a tree trunk. If you cut it off, you'll see a tree trunk with all these circles. And if you look at the tree trunk, you're going to see that sometimes they're uneven, and that sometimes there are spots in various points. And sometimes these spots, you know, when I go to Europe and so on, I carry little examples of tree, but here I'm doing it. Sometimes a spot will do a line, and it'll go all the way, or half the way, or some of the way. And that's the tree got traumatized at this particular point. And the person who knows about trees is going to tell you that at age so-and-so, this tree had a shock, or something happened. And then that person who knows about trees is also going to tell you that this thing that happened in there at age so-and-so of the tree continued to affect the tree the following year and the following year and the following year, but then no longer affected the tree when it got older. And then other spots continue to affect the tree. So you're going to get all kinds of variations from, let's say, and now I'm going to use children's ages instead of the tree, that something happened at age 2 and continues, and now I'm going to say a survival conclusion. I will define them, but I'll just use the word. A survival conclusion got set into that child's ego state at age 2 and is still operating, or it got set at let's say at age 3 or at age whatever, and continued to operate up to age 7, but then no longer was very important after age 7. So now I'm talking in terms of that concept, and now I need to say a little bit about my view of child development. And one of the things I'm very grateful for is, or in terms of TA, working with adults, is that I worked with children for 5 years. I was a child therapist before I got into TA. So that it got to be a little bit, you know how therapists, we get some things into our bones, sort of our feeling, our intuition. So I got a little bit of a sense in me of whether I'm talking to a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old. It's a little different. But those of you who've had children or nephews or grandchildren or worked with children or kindergarten or babysitting or whatever, you know that. So you don't have to, you know that. If you will just put yourself into the frame of mind, draw on that knowledge, that you know the difference between how you deal with a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old and a 5-year-old. That's all. Just the way you know the difference between dealing with a child ego state and a parent ego state. That you know from your regular TA. Okay. And now child development. What happens is, this I've written a little bit more about the egos, the okay part of the person, that there is kind of the child is born euphoric, okay, all of you have learned the TA, and I talk in terms of a fifth position in TA, because I refer to the mature adult as being different than the adult. So my child development view is that the baby is born with an euphoric, okay, like the way Burns said, born a child, but euphoric. That there is a big disappointment occurs around 6 months or so when the child begins to have a sense, I'm using very gross terms, when the child begins to distinguish between self and other. And at that point, wishes the rattle to come back or the food to come back and isn't always there. And there is this strong feeling of desperation. Melanie Klein has written about it, which isn't shown most. When I talk to people who have children, they say, oh, no, that never happened with my 6- and 8-month-old baby. My baby was always happy and so on. It's not quite true. I mean, if you watch very carefully, something happens. There's, at least on some level, a kind of a disappointment with mother who doesn't help anymore, doesn't help with toothache and doesn't help with bellyache and so on. She's supposed to take care of everything. And at that point, the child chooses one of two defensive positions. And the defensive position is either, I'm not okay, you're okay, meaning mother will take care of it, I don't have to do anything about it. Or I'm okay, you're not okay, that's I have to scream, do a lot, especially as the child grows older. That would apply more perhaps to a 2 or 4 or 5-year-old child, experiences that mother and parents, when I say mother, I mean caretaker, parents, the environment, is unreliable, alcoholic, whatever it is, drugs, whatever. If I don't do anything about it, it won't happen. So the child arrives around between 2 and 4 in the thing, arrive at what I call, one of two what I call defensive positions, defense against the not okay. And that's a defense, a preferred defense position. And the preferred defense position is either I'm not okay, you're okay, or rather I use my child more than my parent, or I'm okay, you're not okay, I use my parent more than I use my child, or I call them type 1, type 2. I'm going very fast, but because I want to go on to the material we have here. And eventually, past now, I consider in terms of development, that we have the child, as I said, all these stages of child. And the child ego state formation, I consider, changes according to their colors, different colors on the tree trunk, also with the tree. And there is sort of a significant difference, the 2 to 4-year-old stage, then the 4 to 7-year-old stage, the early script formation. We're going to get back to that. And then between 7 and all the way teenage and so on, somewhere the parent ego state really consolidates itself, and you could have circles for the parent ego state, 2 different parent ego state forms. So there are also different layers for the parent ego state, according to the parent I had when I was 2, and the parents I had when I was in school, my teachers, and the parents I may have had as I said, I even have a psychoanalytic parent who taught me much later. So the parent ego state has different formations. And then somewhere along the line, after the teens gets this new adult, that I call it, a really important adult that deals with reality. And so to that adult, I call the 5th position. That's the mature adult. I have different names for it: the adult sober, the adult mature, the adult reasonable, whatever. Richard Erskine has another term, the integrated adult, whatever term you want to use. I call it the 5th position.
You said the 5th position?
5th, because there's the original adult, the original okay, which is euphoric, the infant. And we only arrive at a really good adult, okay. It's the okay, which is really has gone through all kinds of not okays, me and the other, and finally has a mature adult, which really is accepting of humanity with its pluses and minuses. And that's the 5th position. Okay. So this is in order to talk a little bit about developmental. So I'm now going back to the child ego state. And here is this growing child, and there's a very significant period that occurs. I've talked about this infancy and the okay business. The 2-year-old, roughly, the 2-year-old stage, 2 to 4-year-old stage, is in the child, is a very, very, very significant time, because that's when the child is beginning. Erickson uses the word autonomy. We don't. We say autonomy is more mature, but uses independence, let's say. The child is testing independence. This is a child who can begin now, who can really run and move around. It's the typical child who gets lost in Safeway, and because she or he knows his way around until he or she finds out that he's lost and is terrified and screams. And but it's the child who is learning to, quotes, do for himself, think for himself in his or her own way. In German, there are 3, you say it, you can say it, it's so much more comfortable than all the his or her. But then people get shocked if I refer to a child as it, so I learn to say, okay. So, this child, the 2 to 4-year-old stage, this child is developing independence, developing relationship with mother and father, or with parents, with the environment, with what he can, and is very experimental. Now, that's the subject of another workshop when I talk about drives, that we have underlying drives, and they are, which I call motivators sometimes. And we have 3 different kinds of motivators. I'm summarizing a lot of stuff. This is all pre of what we're really going to be talking about here, but to give you a background. We have 3 underlying drives. One of them are motivators. I call them to distinguish them from Freud. Freud says drives, and I define them differently, so I say motivators. Sometimes I'll say use the word drives, it's easier. We have 3 underlying drives. And nowadays, we really understand more things that before were mysterious, but you know, it's in the 22nd century that they're going to be able to pin down these things with the brain. Nowadays, we only understand that so there are circuits that go this way and circuits that go that way and circuits that go that way, and it's perfectly acceptable now to say that there are 3 different types of circuits. I use sometimes the analogy of languages. You can communicate meaning in different languages, but they still go differently. You still can't translate literally from one to the other. So we have 3 different, and one of them is the survival drive. And the other is the drive that Freud called sexual, because he thought it takes care of the survival of the species. I do not call it sexual because for humans, the species has survived not only thanks to procreation, it's also survived thanks to our ability to create, or we would have been eaten by the other animals. So instead of calling it the sexual, which is an attribute of this drive, I call it the passionate drive or the expressive drive, the creative drive. I've given it many different words, but it's again the drive which has curiosity and risk-taking, which is a very human thing. Animals don't have it. Animals procreate, and that's how they take care of the survival of the species. Humans do more for the survival of the species than only procreate. They do all kinds of other things. And the aspects, the attributes of the second drive are curiosity and exploration, risk-taking, without which there wouldn't be invention and exploration. So I said that 3 drives. Number 1, the survival drive, and I don't need to spell out that one, whatever we need to do for survival, which includes strokes and including relating to other people and so on, but obviously getting food and survival drive. The second drive is the creative, expressive drive that I referred to, which takes care of the survival of the species, isn't aim. And the third is, again, the transience. For animals, it's sleep. It's getting away from reality. It can include sleep, but it includes being very spiritual, being very lost in the clouds would be a very good term. And the time structure operates in 3 different ways according to each drive. You can tell which drive you're in according to the way you relate to time. The survival drive relates to time chronologically. And Burns' time structure applies to the survival drive, which you all learned in the 101. The expressive drive you know perfectly well when you're involved in something very creative and very active, you lose track of time. You have to look at the clock, or somebody has to remind you. These poor airplane pilots, that's a very good, they got fascinated with their computer, and they forgot that they had to watch the clock and land the plane. You read about it in the newspapers, okay? So the expressive drive can operate in all kinds. They were fascinated with something that was happening. And the transience drive, also you lose track of time. You certainly lose when you're sleeping, but you also lose track if you're in deep meditation or if you're in a spiritual endeavor, you are outside time. Okay. So these drives are underlying. And let me say something that, you know, think for a moment. To me, it's what is it makes a child start walking, start talking, get involved in learning all these words, working so hard. Have you seen a child working or even working to learn to do steps? How hard these children work. They work and work and work. And much of that work is thanks to the creative drive, and not necessarily is a mix of survival and creative drive. Because unfortunately, now I'm getting back to my 2 to 4-year-old. The 2 to 4-year-old is very driven by this expressive drive. The survival drive tends to be more important during the very early time. And when we talk about the infant and strokes and programming and relationship and all of which are important, and then of course all of TA is built on this concept of needing to exchange strokes. And it's all related primarily to the survival drive. But there is a whole dimension of us that is related to the expressive drive and to the transience drive. And here in talking script, episcript, and decisions and so on, I'm going to be focusing primarily on activity, on development related to the expressive drive. Some other workshop we may focus, or a more spiritual workshop, or meditative workshop, or religious workshop, or so on, you may focus more on aspects of the transience drive, and some other workshop, your good 101, your basic 101, we're focusing, when we talk strokes and relationships, we're focusing on the survival drive. I repeat here, I'm going to talk more about ways in which this is a result of the motivation of the expressive drive. So around 2 to 4, this expressive drive is pushing very hard because that child is pushed to learn, to walk, to run, to find, to develop, to understand. Hard, not that it didn't start at 1 and 18 months, and I keep wanting you to remember there are all, but I'm going to here now talk primarily about 2 to 4. So 2 to 4 is this great exploration, and you know the statistics about children drowning in swimming pools because they haven't been watched for 1 minute, and they got off, falling off mountain cliffs, or falling out of the window. All the burn units of hospitals filled with children who pulled down something from the stove, the burning stove, and got burnt, and so on. So this is the age where children, if not supervised, but they can't be supervised every second of the day and night. So what happens? Our system, and now that's a part of the survival system. You see, all 3 drives work together. But the survival system is terrified, so to speak, if we give it a personality. I give our drives the personalities, like goddesses watching over us, like the Greek goddesses have them. So the survival drive is terrified about what the expressive drive is pushing that child to do. That child is going to kill herself. So there is another built-in system within us to take in what I call survival conclusions, messages that are going to keep us safe. Because if we don't integrate, if those of us, so all of you have received enough survival conclusions that you're still alive today. You have not fallen off the window, you have not drowned in swimming pools, you have not burnt yourselves at the stove, because you have something operated in you, and survival conclusions operate like instincts, like inborn instincts. So now I'm about to define a survival conclusion. A survival conclusions, which I consider then like points, messages within us, integrated, that are so strongly integrated that they're not in words, because most of the strong survival conclusions operated between are integrated between 2 and 4. So they have become almost nonverbal. Very few people can actually consciously remember. Some do because they had an accident. Mother or father saying don't about the stove, or don't about falling off the window, or don't about cutting yourself, putting the knife. Some do a little bit later. But essentially, and survival conclusions operate like instincts. The animals, you know, donkeys don't fall off the sharp when they're climbing up. I was raised in Turkey, and donkeys can go at the edge, at the very edge, and they don't fall. Cats usually don't have accidents falling off the tree and so on, very seldom. So animals have more built-in instincts to keep themselves alive. We have a few, we have reflexes, like the eyes a little bit blink, but we have less instincts than we need in order to keep alive. The evolution has done it in this way. And what evolution has done instead has given the 2 to 4-year-old child the ability to integrate messages and take them as instincts, like to operate like instincts. So that any one of you would jump back if I were trying to push you through the window. You would try and push back. Or any one of you would push back against the fire or watch it and so on. So you all have learned. How did you learn this? You learned it so it's all thanks to the survival drive, and you learned it usually with strokes. Either that somebody gave you positive strokes, darling, don't do that several times, held. Or negative strokes. Don't let me catch you do that again, okay? And sometimes that's another thing through shame, and that's another thing that operates in the 2 to 4-year-old. Very strong. So we have a certain number of survival conclusions operating through shame. And that is a major topic that I can refer you to some articles I have written. But shaming operates just like stroking, positive or like negative stroking. And shaming can operate not only from the parents, but from the community or other children or whatever. Again, shaming up to a point has a social function. In our society, children don't urinate on the living room rug, or they don't parade around nude, or they don't urinate in their beds, and so on. And many children have learned through strokes, and some have learned through shaming. And that is a huge other topic, because we may have integrated harmful survival conclusions that are more than certainly about exposing oneself and one's body and touching and so on. Many of us have very strong survival conclusions about not touching parts of our body that would be examples that some of you can identify in yourselves. And survival conclusions tend to stay with us the rest of our lives. Now, the difference, and since they're nonverbal, usually acquired at this 2 to 4-year-old age, where they came in not in so many words, but in behavior, they can be translated into words. But the actual survival conclusion has been taken in organically. It's the gut. It's like an instinct. So we have a large number of survival conclusions that are positive, that we all have, as I gave you the example. All of us, we acquired them in different ways, but some of them have also, and we have a lot of survival conclusions that are no longer necessary but not harmful. They, they're cultural survival conclusions sometimes, and we change culture, for instance, about dressing and undressing, or some of them, if they're not very strong and not very shamed, they're just general. One would say, oh, I don't like to show myself this way or that way. Or they can even be survival conclusions on a simple way about washing your hands before you eat. That's for some people it's very strong, or brushing your teeth, or whatever it is. Some, but then you don't feel like a monster if you haven't brushed your teeth one night before going to bed. Some people feel like it's the end of the world. You see, again, the survival conclusion made to take these unimportant survival conclusions, but the ones that we go. And of course, handicapping survival conclusions, or we call them archaic survival conclusions. And these would be the subject of therapists. And I like to give the example, some of you may have read it because I've used this example so often, because sometimes something looks like a major therapeutic issue, and it's a very small example, but it's a survival conclusion. So there's Tom, he's a businessman, and he's puzzled. He's in a workshop. It was not a therapy workshop, it was a sort of a business communication kind of workshop, but he brings in this personal issue. He's a little bit puzzled about that and bothered and embarrassed about it too, but he dares bring it. He says, it hasn't happened before, but the last few months, every time my boss comes in the office, I have a tremendous desire to hide under the desk, under the desk. I feel, a physical compulsion. Now, I can control it. We have all these other mechanisms that we develop. I can control it. I hold on to the desk and I hold on to the chair. But it means that during the first 5 or 10 minutes, I can hardly hear what the boss is saying because I'm so busy making sure that I don't crawl under the desk. And he's pretty sophisticated. He knows a good bit about therapy. And I've considered that. Is it an authority problem? Is it a relationship with the boss? Is it this? Is it that? Well, he's excluded, and the group were excluded. It's a perfectly nice boss. He's known the guy for a number of years. They've gotten along well. All these other factors that one would obviously look for about why would he hide from this boss. And so I'm looking, what's new in the last few months? Well, the only thing is a very good piece of news that I've been moved from sitting in a cubicle to sitting in my own office where I have my desk. And it's my own office, but it's not my desk. I thought it's not my desk. I tried sitting somewhere else. What is it? Well, we get a little bit closer, and so you can only find a survival conclusion almost by a deduction of, you can't get it the way you would get a redecision. We'll get to redecision. You're getting assumptions, hypotheses. Well, and so through a little bit, you ask, what was the situation in your home like when between the age of 2 and 4? I get very to hypotheses, because that's where we're getting in a domain, and I'm not going into a chair, or we try and figure out guess. So we came very fast with an educated guess that Papa, where they lived, well, he told me in the situation, what was your relationship to your father? Good relationship, but once in a while, when he came home drunk, I used to hide under the bed. Okay. Why did you hide under? Well, I learned that that's the. So how did you know about hiding under the bed? Well, when the door slammed. What's new in this? The connection is, he's moved into this new office where he has a door, and the new boss, and the same boss from before, when he walks in, slams the door. So it's a condition, the survival conclusion sometimes is almost like a conditioned reflex. You can compare it with that you know a lot in the Ukraine about our condition. It's sometimes a signal sets it off. So the door slams, the boss comes in, but it's more because it's the boss. When other people come in with the door slam, it doesn't affect him. But the boss and the door slamming down under the desk. So, treatment. You can't eradicate them completely, but you can use the adult to deal with them. Now he knows about it. So he knows about it, he can talk to the boss and say, please don't slam the door, it bothers me. You can become humorous about it. You can joke about wanting to hide under the desk. You can pretend to hide. You can do all kinds of other things. Anti-survival conclusion or anti-shame. And that way, they lose the strength, so that it's not exactly like a redecision thing. It's more, I have this is a little quirk in me. It loses its importance, it loses its kind of thing. Pretty much like, I get scared by thunder and lightning. Well, I know that, I jump, etc. But then I pretty much can deal with it after that. So it becomes a light thing instead of a heavy, and stays there. Okay. You can have survival conclusions, you can have decisions, and you can also be decisions which are yours, or you can also feel determined in certain areas of your life by certain injunctions you may have taken on as a child. And these are all subjects for therapy. And according to your practice or whatever it is, you're going to be working with that. And presumably, if it's a don't think or don't what other exam or don't live or whatever, you're narrowing it down to the specifics for your particular client. Am I right? Anybody want to argue with me against it? Okay. So can we drop that right now? Because all we are saying is all these are perfectly okay things to work with for therapy, but that does not mean script. All I'm saying is this is perfect. Okay. So now, next chapter, script. And now we're back to developmental story. So we've dropped therapy again, and we're back to development. So we had the 2 to 4 year old child, and all these things happened 2 year 4. And now you get the 4, 5, 6 year old child. And that is the 2 to 4 is a fantastic period. in terms of this developing independence and separation from parents and quality and new knowledge and new aptitudes and all this. And now you get the 5-year-old. It's plus or minus. Look at the 5-year-old. Can you visualize a 5-year-old? That 5-year-old now is a very powerful person. That person has really mastered the most important things to be mastered in this world. It, in order to use the German it instead of he, she, it really has a broad vocabulary. It can often speak several languages, or not necessarily, but whatever. It can run, it can walk, it can climb, it can explore, it can read, it can translate if necessary. I've seen so many young children, and especially in multicultural situations, where the 5-year-old is translating for the parent whatever they know. It can handle the computer. There's a lovely cartoon I loved in the New Yorker about 2 kids talking to each other, 2 5- or 6-year-olds, saying, the worst of it is they want me to program it so the parent controls in the computer. They know more than the parent, I mean, they can do it on the computer and the parent can't. So they are really and as little people, they are referred to now as little people, and they get all these condescending comments from people who now feel that they can communicate with them. What are you going to be when you're grown up? Whom do you admire? Or sometimes they get not injunctions, instructions. Be like your mommy, or don't be like your mommy, be like your daddy. You're a big girl, you're a little girl, you're this, you're that. Lots of attributions in the meaning, a different meaning of attributions than I use it. Lots of you are this and you are that, you're just like Grandma Lise, or you're not like, you don't be like Uncle so-and-so who ended up in the insane asylum and so on. You get lots of be, you lots of don't be, you lots of stuff when you grow up. Lots of, well, you can drive a car when you're grown up, but you can't drive it now. All right, but you can, you're so big you can watch over little sister and so on, but you can't, you can't smoke, you can do that when you're grown up. All these things that you're being told that you are going to be able to do when you're grown up, or not all these that you're not supposed to do either. And how are you going to manage when you're a 5-year-old? And the 5-year-old begins to start really thinking about the future, which so far the child has been very much in the here and now. A little bit of future of when will, but even so, there's a lot of future. You can't have your candy now, you can have it later. What's later? When? In a minute? In 5 hours? When? Later. Later, when you're grown up. That's big, big stuff. Okay. So they've got lots of stories now. Some of it they can read, some of it they're told. They pick up gossip, they pick up information around them. The world is kind of big by now. They're in kindergarten. They've lots of other children, lots of other parents, the world has become, this is a huge world all of a sudden. Not all of a sudden, but you realize, I mean, when you compare to a 3-year-old's world, for instance, this is even a child who's gone to play school or whatever it is. So the child is, and I think this drive, just this, keep thinking that there is, what is it compelled us as little children to want to walk, to want to talk. And the same drive, the expressive drive, I want to figure out what my future is going to be. How is my future going to be? I love this little song, the Mexican song, what da 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 da. What will I be? This will I be that? Qui sera? Yeah. Qui sera? Sera. So mother doesn't answer something very satisfactory. Will it be this? Will I be that? There's also this sex, and certainly expressive drive certainly does include sex. So I'm not eliminating Freud's ideas. I'm just not saying that that's the answer to everything, but certainly lots of sexual feelings, masturbation, new feelings about the body, playing doctor, all these things are happening. Different children, different stages, different cultures, contrasts among cultures, especially in America by now, in kindergarten, experiencing other cultures, other ways of being, etc. So what will I be when, now, Freud's little boy, when he was 5, went and said to Freud, I want to marry mommy when I grow up. And this terrified Freud. And he figured that, my God, this child has all kinds of perverse ideas, and this child is having unconscious feelings about, I'm angry at him because he reacted in this way, and I want to kill him, and so on. So an awful lot of the Oedipal conflict and so on occurs in psychoanalysis as a result of, but you know nowadays, many, many little boys announce that they want to marry mother when they grow up, or they want to marry son and mother. The children, parents are now taught to say in a very nice way, no, darling, you can marry someone like mommy when you grow up, instead of mommy herself. Or little girl says, I want daddy, and so on, or on his lap, or so on. Also, little girls very busy. If I disappear, daddy, from this world, whom will I marry? It's another big question, Mary, isn't it? Can be. If I get daddy out, if daddy flies away, oh, okay. So there's not only security issues, it's fantasy issues. So script. So this is when this child is building up his or her script. And script and identity are very closely related. And the child lives in a magical world, the thinking. You see, if children didn't have magical thinking, they really couldn't function well enough, because there's so much magic around them. The faucet, you turn it around and the cold water runs, and you turn it this way, and hot water runs. And TV, we accept a lot of magic now, is a part of our lives. You know, yes, there's scientific examples of, if I push that button, the TV comes on. But we do and we don't. There's another cartoon which I love, which is a little boy, again, like maybe a 4-year-old, and father, and there's a car and the flat tire. And the father says to the little boy, the text, no, we cannot change the channel on this one. You see, I mean, that's very typical good script child behavior. We can, if we know how to turn the button, we can change the channel. But exactly how and what, we do know and we don't know. Wishing will make a lot of things, and nowadays, look how this kind of thinking operates still nowadays, that all the bios of people, this book, which if you wish something, it'll happen. What's this book? It's The Secret. If you stand in front of a shop window and you look at that emerald ring, sooner or later you're going to get it, if you wish it hard enough. And the other side of it is, if you don't get it, you're to blame. You didn't know how to wish. See, that's the other part of it. You don't have powers. If you either have magic powers, or then what if your magic doesn't work? It's very scary, very scary. So the other thing, so the child has to build up a story for the future. I want to give you this kind of impulse of building it. And it is not a pathological thing, for gosh sakes. It's the healthiest thing that the child can do, to try and put all these different pieces together, weave them together, connect them together in some kind of a way that's going to make sense, some of it. So there are favorite stories, and sometimes the child reads this story and says, that's right for me. And that, oh no, but then this, but then this, but then this. Read yourself too. maybe this for the future, or no, or that other child is doing. So it's a very complicated weaving system. And we have to remember also that, think about yourselves, we have areas of preferences. We don't go just like that. Yes, the example with sex or marriage is mother or sex, but that's the kind of people we relate to. Good people, bad people, but also people who, the models we get, that kind of people who are clever at doing this, people who are dumb at doing this, people like me. Then we look at geography. For instance, I am so clear that in my script was this whole business about water. Because for me, as an only child, the big consolation in Turkey, looking out the window and looking at the Golden Horn and watching the sunset, and this yearning, not necessarily that I could always be near water, but when I feel, this is the prescription for me when I feel bad, is looking at water and the sun. There's no amount of stroking that can do quite the job of looking at the sun going down the horizon on a body of water, because it'll bring me back to all these times when this was the wonderful situation. Comparable to home cooked soup, comparable to strokes and stuff like that, but take it in other dimensions too, not just with the stroking. For me, yes, I don't certainly need strokes, but I mean, this is one example. So there's geography. For some people, it's living near the sea. For some people, it's living near the mountains. For some people, it's by the river. For some people, in nature. For some people, in the city, to hear the lovely honking of those cars for some people, which is the horror for other people, and so on. So there's geography, there's relationships, there's age, there's occupation, doing something sitting down or standing up or using your body or not using your body, or that range of areas is tremendous. And to reduce it, what I can't stand with the old TA stuff of talking about script is making it so reductive. And then if I ever hear somebody saying, I'm trying to get so-and-so to get rid of their script, I say, well, then that person is going to become a zombie. If you get rid of your script, then you're nothing. Yeah.
One of the things I think
yeah.
is that you can create awareness to create a better script, because the way we communicate as people is in stories.
I don't hear. The way to communicate.
The way we do communicate as people is in stories. So there may be different cultural stories.
Yeah.
So I take your point. I don't think you could ever take someone out of a script, because we're all in a story, and it's just some stories are better than others.
That's right. And we live out a story. Now, I have given you this, and you're going to read it at leisure, and a lot of it is in this. I'll tell you a little bit about it, and I purposely didn't want you to have it in advance necessarily. I wanted you to, but then I think that this will reinforce. This is 1988. And originally, when I wrote this about scripts, I wrote it in my Eric Byrne, what you say after you say hello, in the Graham Bonds, 1979. As far back as that, I wrote about survival conclusions and scripts, my view of scripts, which is pretty much the same thing. And what's happened is that it's been taken over in Europe. It is being taught a lot in England, some. I don't know about Adrian and so on, but the SILS, all that group, teaches script the way I teach it, and all over Germany and France and wherever I've been able to have an influence, but I was not able to affect American therapists, and a large proportion. And I want to read out of this the very end, the summary of it, the definition of scripts. So it spares us a lot of, and then I want to, in summary, and you can read it here, and so I'm going to read it very fast. In summary, I define scripts. They contain genetic elements and patterns genetic elements and patterns. What do I mean by that? That we are driven to do a script. The genetic says we're driven to learn to talk. We're driven to learn to walk. We're driven to learn to write, to learn communication. We are driven to figure out a script. This is a necessary feeling in this 4 to 6-year-old child, something like that, to set up some kind of a pattern. So that's what I mean by genetic. And there are parts, I think, that do tie into the genes. It's not clear, and in the 22nd century we'll know more about it. There are aspects, attributes that are, for instance, I'll tell you 2 examples. I heard Craig Ventnor, who is the genome, who discovered the write-up of the genome. And he describes him, and I read his biography too, and he describes himself as a very courting danger, dashing his motorcycle, his little bicycle originally, into the wall, and then his motorcycle and the sailboat. And he's only happy when he gets onto the sailboat, even as a grown-up, and does dangerous things in the storm and so on, and conquers the elements. And it's a lot of script stuff, as I hear him describe it, you know, conquering the giants and conquering the waves and using the sails to do all this and navigating and so on. So he, in his book, he describes himself like that, which meant he was a difficult child and so on. That's a different story, and a difficult person in studies and everything. He was a school dropout and so on. That goes sometimes in his particular thing. Had he had a therapist, the therapist would have tried to get him to get rid of his script, and then we would not have found the sequence. So whatever it is, but he said that these aspects of him were the important aspects leading to this discovery. Courting danger, risk-taking, the very same aspects that caused him all kinds of social difficulties and problems with his bosses. Just a few days ago, did any of you see Charlie Rose with Watson, James Watson, who discovered the genes again? Yeah.
The DNA.
Yeah, the DNA. So James Watson, he's gotten a lot of trouble socially. You know, he puts his foot in his mouth all the time and said all kinds of things. So he was joking with Charlie Rose. And he said, he said 2 things. He said, the 22nd century will be the century of psychology, because so far we don't understand what's going on. People can only do it through imagination, through clinical, through whatever and eventually they're going to be able to figure it all out, but we can't figure it out. Okay. But the other thing that he said about himself is he said, I'm impatient. I'm impatient, and he obviously was pleased to say that, and he said it with a big smile, a little bit what we would say a script smile, which would be something we would want to do therapy about, because the gallows, he sort of smiles, he says, they don't invite me on committees. So obviously his child obviously very pleased that he gets rejected by committees, although his adult obviously does want to be on committees and have more impact. So he was describing about the fact that he's, you know, doesn't have the social graces to have appropriate impact and so on. Okay, but it's certainly not something he would have wanted to be cured of. So I am saying that that's a puzzle. Here again, my sentence, summary of the script. So, scripts contain genetic elements and patterns. So the genetic is there. So some of our scripts are not the detailed content, but the direction, the emphasis of the script. Like, is it a script for an impatient person? Is it the script of a risk-taking person? Or is it the script of somebody who wants to be quiet by the fire? I mean, it's also that. Okay. So genetic elements and patterns related to. So genetic past experiences, fantasies, and beliefs. So experiences are the child's situation in his or her environment. Fantasies, the stories, the fairy tales, however many, and what we imagine. What we imagine, for instance, child imagines that the airplane flying off into the horizon, the person disappears forever. And they disappear forever if they have been wished away. But you can unwish them also, and then you can bring them back. That's perfectly good script piece there, okay. But you see, I'm talking about it not as a therapy thing, as a life thing. So fantasies, beliefs. Now, they include all kinds of religious stuff. According to children are taught that you will go to heaven or you won't go to heaven or whatever. That's included in your script. Not that we won't then modify them, but this is something we guide ourselves with, right, good or bad, okay? They're woven together. Weaving is very important because one thing balances the other very often in a script. So woven together. You can imagine somebody dead, but you can also imagine somebody coming back to life. You can make up for it. It's all scripty, but you see, not therapy stuff. All I'm trying to say is it's not therapy stuff. Okay. In the fabric of a personal mythological story, it's like the myths of ancient Greece or whatever myths of Indian myths. I had a very close friend who wrote Indian folklore, and he used to come with me in some of my script workshops, and people would be working with their scripts, and he'd sit there, and since he knew hundreds of folk tales, he'd written a book on Indian folk tales, he could always come up with a folk tale which fit exactly what this person was describing about their childhood and their life in the Western culture. Never heard about India before. So it's amazing how universal the myths in the themes. There are all these very specific characters, and they behave in these different magic ways that offset. There's always the hero and the villain and different ways of getting through the script of the story, and which is the script of my life. Okay. So many possible variations. Such patterns can lead both to positive and negative outcomes according to the manner in which they intermesh and evolve. And that's very important because I kept talking about the 5 to 6 year old, but that 5 to 6 year old has a way of growing up. And as that child grows with the story gets modified and looked at and chiseled. But there's the basic story, which Eric Byrne called the palimpsest. And later on, I want to talk about the difference with Eric Byrne. But I mean, certainly, he gave us the idea in TA that script is a story and starts at that age. So it's a story. But I like the idea of script, the analogy to a movie script. Because think of a movie script until it finally appears on screen. It has started as a story, a novel or something, and then it gets adapted, and the script writer and the director and the actors, and then some of these stories, the movie Apocalypse Now, I remember way back, it was done with 2 endings. It had the happy ending for the American audience, and it had the tragic ending for the European audience. So the same story then gets woven, gets steered to a happy ending, and it gets steered with all the ups and downs and whatever it is. Okay. So I say that scripts have non-specific endings, and one of the errors of the way script is taught in TA is this whole idea, you have an injunction, don't be happy, and so therefore you're going to have an unhappy life, end of script, and so I'm going to cure you, and now from now on you're going to be happy. I'm sorry, that's a little bit exaggerated, but you know, a little bit of a simplistic approach about script. Or you have a loser script, and now I'm going to help you be a winner. Nonsense. We're all winners in some ways and losers in others. And the biggest example of that is Eric Berne, who talks about winner and loser. He was a big winner in some areas. Certainly, he created our whole system. He was a loser in his marriage. He had 3 marriages, and he was in the process of divorcing in the 3rd marriage. So he certainly was not a winner in there. And he was something in between in various other areas. He ended up finding a way to live in the area where he liked to live, in Carmel, which was just where he wanted to live in other city, and so on. So you can take anybody's life and script, and some of their script, they're going to be successful in some areas, and it may be in other areas they will not achieve everything that their script called for, or their script will have damaging elements. I'm going to come back to that later on. Okay, I have to be okay. Okay, then I'm continuing with that. So, according to the information evolved, so scripts have non-specific endings. A script is valuable as an organizing support structure, and that's very important, as an organizing support structure. And I mean by that I think psychotic people don't have a script. That is their some of their problem. They're all over the place. They haven't been able to organize. The script organizes. And a psychotic person has all this input and isn't able to get them together. And to the extent that one helps the psychotic, I mean, there's all the other problems with psychotics and medication and whatever. I'm not, as I said, we don't know the half of it. Apparently, again, I saw a program, they said we don't know any more about schizophrenia than was known 30 years ago. We will know once we can. So, but the important thing is that is the general common denominator about somebody who is psychotic, is they can't organize their lives. They can't take hold of their lives. And medication to the extent that it helps them narrow what's going on and perhaps develop some kind of a script for themselves. Not necessarily a great script. I mean, you can have okay. So then the other thing that script does is enable us to play with various options in fantasy. And that's important also because we can imagine ourselves doing this and then backtracking. And actually, this is what leads into adolescence. The whole thing about adolescence, my friend, that causes so much trouble to parents and communities, is that adolescents are playing around with their script. They're experimenting this way, and they're experimenting that way, and the script gets more consolidated after adolescence, which means after age 20, 21, something like that, because adolescence gets extended. And so when we're working with somebody's script, it's also important to have a sense of what that age is, and so I'll come back to that. So then I continue the analogies to a theatrical script, and it holds if we think of improvisational theater, which takes a preset play or script, but then modifies and modifies and so on. And it's through the interweaving of many strands of patterns that each individual creates the unique quality of his or her life. Tentative predictions are possible in small ways, with much allowance for spontaneous changes, with much allowance, which means that as therapists, we should not dabble with scripts. And as far as I'm concerned, to this day, I do two very different, if I have a contract, a therapy contract, I do not work with a script. I only work with whatever survival conclusions, decisions, patterns, problems, relationships, issues, because usually the therapy is going to be primarily related in the survival drive and transactions and so on. If I do a script workshop, it's, and by now I've counted up at least 2,000 people I've done over my career. If I do a script workshop, it's not therapy. It's announced not therapy at the very beginning. Want to be clear, you want to do a script workshop, you are curious about your script, you want to work on your script, fine. As long as we are agreed this is not going to be therapy, no therapy involved. We might find in the course of a script workshop that there are some issues that the person may need to work with in therapy, which are handicapping the script or blocking the script or damaging to us the certain aspects of the script. So back again, there's survival conclusions and decisions. So I might say you might want to look at this thing. And we're not going to look at it now. That's all the most I'll ever do is look at this. And the whole idea of the script workshop is simply an enrichment and of the self and something that one can want to work with and look at, or in whatever domain you're going to call it, like education or watching a play, or whatever kind of activity you may do in order to enrich yourself with something for your imagination. Yes?
I have questions about the survival conclusion as it relates to the third motivator. Could you give an example of that conclusion being clear from the transient motivator?
Actually, there aren't many survival yeah. Remember that the third motivator also includes sleep. So, if anything, there you don't have many survival conclusions related to the transients. There's some religious ones sometimes. There may be some survival conclusions related to how I get to heaven or something like that. But other than that, usually the transience is either related, the transience drive is more a mediator between survival and expressive. Usually the conflicts are between survival and expressive, something that one does because of survival, and usually the survival conclusions are because of in the survival drive and not in the expressive. When a person is very strong in the expressive, they disregard survival conclusions. They may then get very scared about what they're doing, but they're doing it. Scared, it would relate to, but that is the subject of the drives and all that. That's the subject of a different workshop. However, if you want to read about that part, I've just got a recent article in the TAJ and something about the trauma. I forget, trauma and resilience, something like that. And that's where I describe the drives, and I describe the drives in relation to trauma. But for the time being, for here, I'm going to just emphasize that the script is motivated by the expressive drive. I will say that the majority of survival conclusions and decisions are motivated by the survival drive. And that's one of the reasons why I don't fuss with therapy issues when I'm talking with people about their script, because the script is bigger than the therapy issues, and very often people can overcome therapy issues thanks to their script. That they still have all these problems, but somehow or other, which is why sometimes we find some great people, we then hear all kinds of flaws about them because they still had all these problems they didn't deal with, but their script, well, I mean, even Eric Berne, certainly his script was to affect people's lives through his thoughts and through his ideas. Certainly you have that coming through out of his script. Exactly what the stories were that he picked up when he was 4 or 5, I didn't have the chance to talk with him about that enough. You have to, the script is also tied to it. It's also and it gets transformed. Let me give you kind of in the area of occupation, for instance. I remember as I was thinking about all these things, my son was about 5 at that time. So I asked him he was younger, 4 maybe. I asked him what he wants to be when he grows up. And what do you think he answered? He wants to be a garbage man. A garbage man. Now, since I knew his situation, I knew exactly why. If it was somebody from the outside, they wouldn't know why. We had at the back door came a big garbage truck once a week, huge, and it took all the unwanted things, including favorite toys or favorite junk he was playing with or whatever. I don't know what was from the trash. And it was this big truck, this great big guy. He was very powerful. He had those thick gloves, thick leather gloves, and he had this rotating machine. And that stuff got in there, and that machine worked it. And then he drove away with it. And he was sitting way up high there. And, you know, I mean, what better life can anybody have? And then I asked him the same question when he was about 8 or 9. You know what he said? A corporate lawyer. Exactly the same thing.
Always dealing with garbage.
Huh? What? Huh?
I said always dealing with garbage.
Yeah, yeah. And modifying and the power and taking all this unwanted stuff and doing something new with it and doing something different with it. Later on, of course, it got modified again. Okay. Very interestingly, by the way. But I'm giving you that more as one small aspect. But that doesn't include the relationship, the place to live, all these other things. Episcript lies very close to my heart, much more so now than before, because it's taken me years and years. And I'll give you a little bit of history about Episcripts and that. Yeah, I've got to make it a little bit personal, and I've got to talk about Eric Byrne here. You see, I picked up, I mean, you know what Eric Byrne, what was being taught about scripts was that Eric Byrne changed his mind a little bit, but originally episcripts were seen more as a negative. Scripts. Scripts were seen negative. And I think that Eric Byrne was very much under the influence, first of all, of Claude Steiner, who was working primarily with drunks and alcoholics, drunks and people, drug addicts and people like that. And Steiner developed the idea of the hermetic script, the tragic script. And Steiner influenced Byrne with this idea about the message from the child of the parent, and Steiner had very much the idea with the witch parent, the mother, and the child takes all these negative messages from the child of the mother and then develops this horrible script. And Byrne had this idea, certainly, which I agree with, about the script developed at age 5 and all the rest of it. But then he very much contradicted himself, back and forth, back and forth. He did say you can have good scripts. There's a very good nowadays there's a very good article by Maria Tosi, which will appear in a collection of Erskine's books. Anyway, she's developed the whole history and the details and everything. I'm not a research person, and I cannot give you all that stuff. But she developed step by step with Byrne about yes and no and positive and negative, lots of contradictions. At some point, Byrne gave us this message that you can't get out of your script without therapy, and he gave an analogy which I don't like at all, which is that it's like someone playing the piano, but it's a piano which is already pre-programmed, and it looks like they're playing it, but they're really it's pre-programmed, and it got pre-programmed at this age at 5 and so on, and so they're living out the script, and the idea is to get out of your script. And then somewhere else he says you can have very good scripts. So it's very jumbled, and as far as I'm concerned, I've heard, and I think that he couldn't quite get away from, as a therapist, and all of us as therapists, we see the complaints department. We don't deal with people when they're happy. We deal with people when they have problems. I remember my former brother-in-law had worked at Sears way back, and he'd worked in the complaint department of Sears. And he would never, in his adult life, he'd worked as a young person, this was when he was 60, he would never buy anything from Sears because he had heard so many complaints about all the material that was brought in by Sears that he could not trust anything done at Sears because he had worked in the complaint department of Sears. So we therapists, we work in the complaint department of people. So when we hear their life stories, seldom do we hear them, well, we may read a biography or an autobiography, but again, people are putting, not getting that kind of material that we get. So we're in the complaint department, and we usually hear the bad things, and then we think about how this affected their lives, and it did. But we don't understand that these are nuggets. That's why I want you to keep thinking about survival conclusions and decisions. They're nuggets, they're pieces. They may be hurting our whole lives. I have knee pains, and so therefore it wakes me up all night, at the night, and it affects me, and I'm sleepy the next day, and have trouble during the night, and so on. But it still is the knee pain. It's not, it's not my whole life. And I need to work with it, and my life is affected, but at the same time, it's not affected, and I can live also a different life in spite of the knee pains. And I'll think of survival conclusions, even bad ones, and so on. So, I discovered the episcript phenomenon during the last 2 years of Burns' life, and this is what's heartbreaking. So, and he did include the reference to episcript in his last book, What You Say After You Say Hello, I'm saying that. And he called it overscript. Overscripts.
What?
You can call it overscript or you can call it episcript. I'll stay with the episcript. He just called it overscript. Okay. So what's an episcript? It is something that gets put into you or put into the vulnerable. I call it now the vulnerable recipient. And I refer to the terms the donor and the vulnerable recipient. And the vulnerable recipient is, or the donor, is somebody who has power over the vulnerable recipient. So that can be the parent, it can be the teacher, it can be the therapist, it can be the boss, it can be someone one has fallen in love with, it can be for all kinds of reasons. It takes two parties. And that person, the donor, transmits to the vulnerable recipient what I call a hot potato, which is negative, always negative. Now we're talking about negative. We're talking episcripts. Transmits a hot potato, which could be an injunction, in the meaning of injunction of suicide, don't live, something very negative. Kill yourself, murder. So it can be an injunction. You can use the term injunction in this meaning of injunction. So the donor may give an injunction, and usually the vulnerable recipient takes it into the child, but goes with it. And if it's several hot potatoes, it becomes an episcript, a construct, an episcript. And the meaning of epi is above or outside the script. And my analogy of an episcript is to cancer. to cancer invading a healthy organ. So this is like a healthy, or this is a picture for cancer. This is a healthy organ. And this is the cancer invading, I forget what it is, a liver, I guess, or whatever organ. And so the aspects of that cancer get in. And so can begin, an episcript can transform a script to the point where it looks like it's the script. In other words, take over the way a cancer will take over a liver or a lung or whatever. And so the function of that organ now is affected and then eventually destructively and eventually affects the whole person, and there is death. Pretty much the way, and this is the way at some point in the past Byrne and Steiner conceptualized script. So it's terribly important to distinguish between episcript and script. The way you distinguish between an organ that has a cancer and an organ that is normal. And for a while, the organ may be functioning with that cancer, but eventually the cancer has taken over. Now, I need to tell you a little bit about the history of the episcript. The way it started was, I have the time for that. The way I started was I was teaching, and I had an assistant who was very, very well educated. He was a PhD candidate, and he was my assistant because he could get all the references for me that I didn't know. And he was training. He was a PhD candidate, and he knew much more than I did, but he was training to be a therapist in another department, the Rogerian department, and he was running groups. And so he used to give me little bits of information about his group. And I would give him little tips here and there. And he once told me about his patient Susie, and he said she's going for the crazy house. And this kind of strange expression. Now, this was a young man who used very scholarly terms usually. That's why he was my teaching assistant. He was all in research and everything. He was moving from research to clinical. It was a very funny term for him to use. It was very funny for him to say crazy house instead of mental hospital or something. She's ready for the crazy house. And he referred to Susie a few times, yes. And then one day he told me with a very satisfied look, yeah, as I told you, Susie's been carted off to the crazy house. And I said, Sandy, this is very strange vocabulary. Do you use that in? No, I don't use that I don't use that with my supervisor or my teachers. But after all, that's what it is. And she was carted off and I knew it, I told you. She was in my group, I told you she's going into the crazy house. Okay, I didn't pay any attention. Except that, we had a whole semester. A month later, he's telling me he's another patient who looks like she's going to be ready for the crazy house. And I said, that's funny, it's strange too. And well, yeah, we get very sick people in this group. It's not surprising to have a few people ready for the crazy house and so on. Why do you use the word crazy house? I didn't ask him this way. I was asking him in a nice way. Sandy, I am curious. How come you use the word crazy house? But really, I didn't know. I mean, now I'm talking about that because that was kind of, well, I learned, my mother used this word. Oh, your mother used the word. How did she use the word? Oh, she'd say, you kids, you're not driving me into the crazy house. I'd rather drive you there. Oh, that's interesting. And did you ever fear that you'd be driven into the crazy house? Well, as a matter of fact, my brother had my brother suicided. He kind of lost his balance. And how's your mother? My mother's okay. She's okay. She's kind of goofy, but she's okay. Did you ever fear? Well, he says, yes, that sort of got me. That's why I got into psychology. I was afraid that I was going for the crazy house. But And heaps, not getting away from crazy house, even though I say mental hospital or imbalanced or crazy, or then I start using the word crazy. So that crazy house, so that really bugged me. And that's where I developed the idea. At that time, I still thought that scripts were negative and injunctions and so on. And but of course I have my background in the Orient and with magic and with all kinds of things there. And I just sort of got the idea that he was operating with a magic idea that, first of all, he got this message or whatever. In those days I used the word script, but I'm not, whatever, this belief in him that he's heading for the, and one of the satisfactions of being a therapist was he could pass it on to his therapist, to his patients, and then he was fine. Each time he told me about this patient, the first one and the other one, he was very smug and very satisfied, and he always knew that would happen. And that's where I got my idea. And then there's a whole complicated story involving me and Eric Byrne, that I had a writing phobia, and but I wanted to present the Episcript and I couldn't write it, and I presented it at a conference, and then Eric Byrne was furious that I hadn't written it, and so on. That's a different story. And finally, I wrote it sort of out of spite on thin paper and sent it to him. And that was 1969. And I sent it to him. He used to say, if you send me, was the editor of the Bulletin at the time, and he don't send me material on thin paper, on toilet paper, he called it. And so, of course, I typed it on thin paper, and wanted him to throw it in the wastebasket. That was a lot of big game transactions between Byrne and myself. But but his adult conquered the situation, I have to say that, and that's how he cured me. Instead of throwing it into the wastebasket, he had it retyped on good paper, and then he corrected it a lot with red paper thing. And I called it the anti-script. And he said, no, call it the Episcript. And at the time, he used the wrong definition of epi. He said epi is outside, like epilogue, epigraph, and so on. And I have recently from Maria Tossi learned that epi is not outside, it's over, which explains to me why later he used the word over. So there was a mix at the time, he too. Anyway, I still call it Episcript, outside the script, that it is, or over the script in the sense of like the cancer is over or into an organ. So that he acknowledged, he recognized that that was something important, much more than I did. Yes? You had a question? No.
Do you have a second?
Yes.
What I'm hearing is that a script is not bad or good. It's just a story. The Episcript is the pathology.
Yes. However, the script is not just a story. The script is like an organ that developed, a good organ, like in the analogy, it's like our lungs or our liver or it's something that's functioning, that's doing a job for us. That's a part of our organism, our lives, that's important. But a cancer comes and invades that organ, and at that point, that organ is harming us, although it's trying to do its job. Like the lung has a cancer in it, and it's coughing, it's causing coughs and all kinds of things. Yes?
So, okay, but with the Episcript, we make decisions to reinforce that we have this hot potato.
Yes.
Just as he decided, his mom gave him the hot potato, so he is now giving it to his clients.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then it gets to be when you have what's the difference between a hot potato and an Episcript? A hot potato, you can compare it more with an injunction. It's a simple thing. And then you get one or two, several hot potatoes, and you build an Episcript is already a story, a way to do it. a method. Like he now finds this, he now operates with his episcript. He studies psychology. He looks for the vulnerable recipient. He didn't have the opportunity to influence his brother or his student. So he becomes a therapist for himself. That was a healthy thing that he was trying to get out. But then he finds he finds a way to pass on the curse. So it's really, instead of using injunction, I could call it a curse. Well, curse is what we call it. The person feels it's an order. And anyway, in this example, so he finds a way. So then he gives the client an episcript to be crazy enough that you end up in the crazy house. It's not enough to become crazy. You have to get into the crazy house. So you do everything you need to do to get into the crazy house. And that client then got the episcript. Or he just took the hot potato and passed on a few hot potatoes. He never developed the episcript for himself. He passed it on.
Okay.
You know the hot potato game. You pass on. So he got that. He didn't want it. He found a way, and then he gave, and the client had the episcript to be crazy in the group, and instead of getting cured, to be so crazy that she ends up going there. So, yeah.
Question about, for clarification on episcripts. You talked about a script being an organizing structure. The episcript invades or takes over. You also talked about the script as, we live our script as we improvise as we go along, so it's not a defined ending.
It's not as tight as an organ, which
right.
doesn't.
So it's not a defined ending, which brings up the question of whether the episcript is an imposed structure, or is it really steering the improvisation in such a way that you're still within your script, but it's aligned with the injunctions, the messages that you've got.
All of the above.
Okay.
All of the above. Because, and there we get into history again. I didn't know what I was onto. I need to tell you that. I sort of had it. I had that one client. And then I had, and you know, where does one find the clients also to show that to you? You don't know. I mean, I did happen to have another client, and that's already after Eric Byrne's death. But that's the only client I had. I had one with drinking and so on, not very clear. I did have another one which developed itself, which was quite surprising. In those days, at that time, I was doing child therapy. The way we did therapy was the therapist worked with the child and somebody else worked with the mother. Usually it was the mother. Suppose nowadays they do family therapy. They don't do it this way. But in those days, that was it with the mother. And this was a situation where the mother brought this girl. She was about 12. She was suicidal. And the mother was very concerned about her, and I worked with the girl. And I recommended that the mother see this other therapist, and the mother seemed fine, but was seeing the other therapist anyway because because we set it up this way. And the girl, at a certain, let's see how it was, the girl got to be quite well and clearly not suicidal anymore. And around that time, the mother just very abruptly said, she wanted to, the girl wanted to leave too, but the mother had gotten very sick and was getting suicidal. There was a balance. I don't remember this exactly, but what happened, because we didn't know what we were dealing with ourselves at those days, but what became clear is it was a balancing act. It was either the mother was suicidal, and she had removed the girl. Then when the girl got back home, the girl got suicidal. It was a balancing thing between mother and daughter. On a conscious level, the mother didn't want the girl to kill herself, which is why she brought her into therapy. But on an unconscious level, she was so scared that then she was getting. So at any rate, that's the other case. I did not have enough cases. Okay, I want to get back because it's only in the past years that I have now begun to really understand this Episcript stuff. Interestingly enough, Pamela Vinn, who nominated me for the Eric Byrne Award for that, understood it much better than I did because she works more with, she worked with nutrition anyway, Pamela Vinn's experience. And she used Episcript theory all over, and she had all kinds of examples, and I didn't know about it until just a few years ago. But what happened since? Here is a picture. Episcript is something that, here is a cartoon, I'll tell you, and it's very funny, you see? And then I wrote it. It's a cartoon from the New Yorker, which I happened to find. And here it is, the sweet little grandfather. He plays a game with a child. And the child, and then poof, and now the child is sick with a cane, and the grandfather is fine. And it was a cartoon in the New Yorker, which I saw around that time, and I couldn't believe the cartoonist gave us this kind of story. Then, nowadays, I know that I can give you examples of Episcript, and it's the 9/11. And that's a complete, perfect example of an Episcript. And the Manson murders is another one. And Jim Jones is another one. So suddenly I realized that it's very difficult for me to find examples in my practice of Episcript, but I can find a lot of examples of Episcripts in the world, or watching outside, or people whom now I've seen amongst people, acquaintances, where they're not in therapy. And here, let's take the 9/11 very simply, and then we can take the Manson murders. 9/11, think about the people who, here it is. The vulnerable recipient has to be suggestible, has to be in a situation of dependence from the donor. It can be the child, of course. But in the 9/11 example, these men, for reasons of their own pathology, were vulnerable to Osama bin Laden. For their child needed for their own needs. And it can be a script need, by the way. It doesn't mean that, it could have been a part of even a good script, that they were looking for someone to lead them into a better way to live, or looking for a task that would get them to feel useful and important. See, that's what I mean about invading the script. They may very well have had a script which called for their dedicating themselves to a worthy cause. And then comes the Episcript. So he comes in and he says, a worthy cause is destroying Americans. So now they've got the hot potato. Notice he's still alive. He's able to pass on hot potatoes like mad. And that is characteristic of the donor. The donor doesn't do it himself. The donor just passes it on. So he gives them the suggestion, he gives them, and then notice that these people, I'm almost 1230, so these people were intelligent. They were not the typical suicide, poverty-stricken. They were intelligent, educated. They took several years to concoct the plan. They had to connect with each other. They had to travel. They had to take classes in flying. They had to plan. This is not. So they had to use, that's the other terrible thing. They use the Episcript can also use adult stuff. You see? Adult data feeds in. That's why I'm using the cancer analogy of it can use all kinds of stuff that would be good stuff. The script to be dedicated, the information about learning. But the Episcript is they have the task. The hot potatoes is the messages. and the message given and taken. This episcript is the task which must be fulfilled. And it can take a long time, because many people live out episcripts years until they finally suicide or die. And these are the hemactic scripts that Steiner often found, or the so-called tragic scripts that were puzzling Eric Berne, that he could see people marching towards destruction. That's not a script, that's an episcript. And dealing with an episcript is going to require, if you identify it, if you're lucky enough, episcript people don't come into therapy. They proceed on their jobs. You only identify them by chance, in friends, in relatives, in society. I just have to finish that just because of time, and then I just finish that. Manson is another fantastic example. You know, this girl has just been, one of them has just come out now from federal prison 20. Do you know the story of the Manson and all these girls? Idealizing Manson, and he told them they have to murder. And they did it with full dedication, and for the Jim Jones people and so on. So that's where you find your examples of episcripts. You're not going to find them in your patients. Or if you do, I found one once I was very lucky. Now your question, I'm sorry.
How does this fit in with addiction?
Beg your pardon?
How does the concept or the theory of episcript fit in with addiction?
Well, some people are addicted for whatever. Addiction is big. They can be addicted because they took drugs for a very other reason. But an addict may be vulnerable to being episcripted. Usually people who give episcripts usually are powerful people who are seen, who are not addicted, but they will find addicts, maybe. Dependence. Addictions is dependent, but you're dependent on the drug. But it can be just dependence on the drug. This is a big topic. But it's not unrelated. I mean, your question, you need to think about it much more, and it's huge. It's huge. But what makes a person vulnerable? They may be vulnerable because of addiction. They may be vulnerable because of being a child. They may be vulnerable because they're very suggestible. You see, vulnerable is suggestible. So people in hypnosis can tell you much more, who work a lot with hypnosis can tell you more. Yeah.
My question has to do with bringing in diagnosis. Sociopath, what you're describing with regard to bin Laden and Jim Jones and Manson, clinically they would be described as sociopaths.
Yes, they have the power. People who have power, yes, you could almost say that a parent who gives a child is a sociopath also. Yes, you could say that. But the point is they don't come into therapy.
Yes. I would build on what Mary's saying, and that is, it sounds like the therapy intervention may happen with the donor, with the hot potato management.
You can get hold of the donor. Yeah, but you seldom get hold of the donor. The best you can hope for is get hold of the person who's carrying an episcript and use magic techniques to get them to throw it out. That's the best. I've had a few people who I identified had episcripts in therapy. I mean, they come for a symptom. You're lucky if they do. If it's a very tight episcript, they don't come in either. But they may come for a symptom or something, or you might in family therapy, you can sometimes identify. In France, Alain Crespel talked a lot about what he called the garbage pail child in a family. And the garbage pail child is the recipient usually of an episcript to misbehave, to get crazy, to whatever, to murder, to whatever it is, from a parent. You can also have seemingly positive episcripts. For instance, Judy Garland received a positive episcript from her mother, who wanted to be singer-artist and couldn't do it. And Judy Garland was pushed into that and suffered throughout her life and was quite suicidal and hated it. Her suicidal was in trying to escape it, but I mean, so she was successful, but it was an awful life. I mean, she lived out an episcript. There's a movie about a pianist. There was a movie recently also, who. What was that? Yeah, the pianist. Yeah, well, no, it's not The Pianist. It's another movie where the father was in a concentration camp, was a pianist and never could. Yes. What's the name? Shine. That's an example of an episcript. The father, and that's a well-intended episcript, but the young man was miserable anyway. So the intention of the donor, from the donor's perspective, sometimes it can be positive. I mean, Osama bin Laden feels that he is helping these people fulfill their destinies. So he thinks they're fine. Yeah.
I would like to give a quick example from my life.
Yes.
My father had a very difficult mother. The only time she allowed him to be some kind of a success was when he got some punishment. And I think that he absorbed into himself the idea that whenever he got successes, he had to have some punishment. His final, most effective thing, he almost immediately induced a heart attack afterwards and died. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a pattern over and over in his life. He tried to pass that on to me. He would tell me tales from the Greek stories of the athletes who died at the moment after their success in the games and so forth. And I realized later on in my life that I had a feeling that if I had a big success, I would have to die. And I had to work very hard to change that with some good therapy and so forth, and to avoid inflicting it on myself.
I am very impressed by that. And do you hear the tone of voice in which he's talking about it? Very different, very strong tone of voice. That's wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, that's where sometimes, yeah, we are able to, or people can get themselves out of episcripts. I am very worried about time because they're going to get after me. So we can talk more about episcripts, but what I want to ask you now is, do you now want to do if you want some case examples some work with scripts now, not episcripts. Some of you want, we did one together in Jamaica. Do you want that? And if so, I have to give you, whoever wants to do it, I have to give you an exercise. You have to do your homework during the lunch break. That's why I want to ask that.
Let me
Yeah.
speak to that. When we were in Jamaica, Fanita did
Yeah.
what she does in her workshop with me. And to do it, if we work with scripts from a psychoeducational
That's
point,
right.
it is not therapy. It's insight, personal insight. If you want to do it, she has to give you an assignment to do over the lunchtime, because you have
I
to come prepared with a few things ahead of time. So that's what she's asking.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what the assignment is, and then you decide whether you do it. It's because of time I'm worried. Okay. So the assignment consists, we can condense it to 3. You don't quite get it right, but it should be 4. But I mean, 3 is, how did we do 4 or do it with 3?
I think we did 4 and ignored one of them.
Yeah, let's do 3. Okay. And it's a little simpler. And the assignment is you write out and you do it fast. You don't give yourself a lot of struggle with your pen and everything. 10 lines or less, and 10 liberal, not small handwriting, 10 lines or less. Stories that affected you, positive or negative, doesn't matter, at 3 different stages of your life. You're all young enough that in your, we may need a 4th, or we may need, or 5th, something, depends on my age. Okay, but we stay with 3. Okay. The first one is under 4. It's not an experience. Please, people always think no, it's a story, like a fairy tale, a nursery rhyme, gossip, picture about the story about the cat. I don't care what, but not your personal, just something that affected you, that you still remember as having been important for you, positive or negative. Either you liked it very much or you hated it very much. Age preferably under 5 or even 4. If you absolutely, since we're doing it in a hurry, can't remember, think of one that you would tell a 3-year-old, under 3 or 2. As primitive a story, it can be 3 lines or 4 lines. It can be a nursery rhyme, that kind of thing, on that level. But it can be a fairy tale, but only 10 lines or less. So that means taking the part of it. It means you don't try and tell the whole story. You tell just the one aspect, like Little Red Riding Hood was with her grandmother and suddenly she realized it was the wolf. Okay, I mean, you know, you're not trying to tell the whole story. I had once, I could do the assignment once by giving everybody to write a Little Red Riding Hood in 4 lines, and everybody's is different. So, okay. So that's before 5 or before 4 if possible. The next one is adolescence, which is anything from 15 to 21, something like that. So late high school, early college, something like that. Depends on when your adolescent really hit you, when you were in a stronger, some. And the next one is in the last 3 years. Not the last month, because usually we still think of the last TV show we saw last month, which we liked very much. That's not it. It's something maybe 2 years ago, 1 year ago, something like that, longer. But recent. Recent, but not very recent. You know what I mean? In the last 3 years, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, that you still remember. Again, very short, only an episode. The rule, I want them to put that on tape. Never, never, never do script work with people just individually. Only at least 4 or 5 people. And that's to guard from their picking up some messages from you, because when they're doing it, they're in a vulnerable condition. So I never, never, never have done it with anybody, individually or with just 2 people. At least a quorum of 5. If 4 who promise to be very careful, and you will see why. Because I ask questions and I ask the group the group does really the work. Ultimately, it's your work, but what you get to hear is into ideas. And since it's a group, you're getting a motley stuff of ideas, and you don't have to buy into anyone. So what happens is that you hear these ideas, and at the end, you're going to come up with something. You're going to get something more. Whereas as it goes on, you're pretty passive. You read this, and you're not asked not to dialogue in it.
Okay.
So let's get story number 1, and you read it very slowly and loud, and with your ice cream cone. All right.
It's another thing we learned, Amy, is this is an ice cream cone.
Yeah.
This is the 0 to 5 story. I was dancing with my partner to the Tennessee Waltz.
Excuse me, that's not you.
No, it's not. But this is, you said it was the story.
It's a story you read or you saw.
Or I
right?
heard.
Yeah. So it's not you dancing.
That's the word.
That's the words to the song.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
That's the words to the song.
I was
Oh,
waltzing with my
oh.
darling
Yeah.
to the Tennessee Waltz. When an old friend I happened to see, I introduced her to my darling, and while they were dancing, my friend stole my darling from me.
Very good. Now you heard that one. Now I'd like you to read the last story, which is less than 3 years ago, or what?
2006.
Very good.
The March of the Penguins, the film. All through the movie, the penguins migrate. As the penguins migrate, the voiceover narrator says, and some of them don't make it, and the camera focuses on the dead carcasses. I had to mull this over as it was so depressing for me. I finally decided to think of it as the March of the Penguins, and most of them make it.
Okay. Very good. Now, I want you people, as us, to tell me, are there any common denominators between this very first story and last story? Common denominators. Anything that's similar in the first story to the last story.